Okay, so we're back. Here is part two of our interactive lecture on slavery topics. And so here's your third question that you need to write down in your notebook. And it is, what were some of the major slave rebellions that happened? Now, we're only going to talk about a few here. There were many of them and lots of interesting things that went on. So if you decide to do some research later on some of these slave rebellions, I'm sure you'll come across some really interesting stories. But go ahead and pause the video so you can get that question down in your notebook. Now, the ones that I'm going to be talking about are Nat Turner's Rebellion. You probably heard about him in other sources that we've studied. The Stono Rebellion. Then there's the Amistad Slave Ship Rebellion and the Haitian Revolution. So these are the ones that we're going to be looking at. So the first one, you'll want to get a few ideas down about this one. You've got Nat Turner's Rebellion. So what you've got with Nat Turner is he was born in 1800 in Virginia, and he was actually born just a week after a guy named Gabriel was executed for a rebellion that he led. And so he heard about this rebellion when he was a kid, and it kind of had a big influence on him. Nat Turner was also a very religious man, and he had these visions that kind of caused him to watch for the right time for him to stage a rebellion of his own. And so there was like an eclipse, and there was some other kind of weird coloration in the sky one day and that kind of stuff. And he took those things as signs that it was time to start his rebellion. And so on August 21st, 1831, Gabriel and a few slaves, they killed a white family in the middle of the night, and then they just kept going. They continued on. They killed white people that they encountered along the way, and in total, they killed 55 white people. They were captured, and then the state executed 55 people. But there were 200 other black people who were killed who were totally innocent, had nothing to do with the rebellion at all, had not joined up at all. And so it was at this time, this rebellion was so bloody and it caught so many people's attention that the state of Virginia actually debated ending slavery, but in the end they didn't. Instead, they just enacted more punitive laws. So the Stono Rebellion, and remember, you guys can pause anytime you want to in this to stop and write down some ideas. But the Stono Rebellion, this was led by a slave from Angola, from the country of Angola. His name was Jemmy. And this happened in 1739 in South Carolina. And so what happened was these 20 slaves, they met together near the Stono River. They broke into a store, they killed the shopkeepers, and they stole the guns so that they could go and they could kill white people along the way. So it kind of has some similarities to Nat Turner's Rebellion in some ways. What's interesting, though, is what they did is they waited until a Sunday because they knew that on a Sunday the masters would be in church and they were the ones who had the guns with them and that kind of stuff. So they knew that they would be away and that that would be a good time to start. And so basically, they went and they killed a bunch of overseers that were along their path. Other slaves joined up, but the other slaves were a little bit reluctant about it because they were pretty fearful about what might happen. I mean, with good reason. There were serious consequences if your rebellion was put down, which this one was too. So most of the slave rebels they were killed. A few of them were sent to the islands in the Caribbean, but most of them were executed. And then South Carolina, that already had an imbalance of population between black and white, where there were more black people living in the state than white people. Well, the white people got scared about that, and so they put a hold on the transatlantic slave trade for slaves being imported from Africa into their state. They said no more for us because they were afraid of what would happen with further rebellions. And then there were also some other restrictions added as a result of this rebellion. But then there's also the addition of teaching Christianity to slaves. So kind of teaching them certain parts of Christianity to pacify them or to make them think that, oh, okay, well, maybe in the afterlife, maybe I'll go to heaven and that kind of stuff if I just suffer through this life on earth and serve my master. And so we know from our Socratic seminars in class that basically slave owners would choose certain pieces of scripture from the Bible to pass on to their slaves to justify slavery. And so that's what they did. Now, the Amistad slave ship is a really interesting story. And so what happened was, we know that in 1808, this transatlantic slave trade to the United States was supposed to stop, right? So here's what happened. In 1839, there are 53 slaves that are captured from Africa's west coast, where many slaves were taken from, and they were taken to Cuba. Well, then they were going to be moved from one part of Cuba to another part of Cuba when one slave broke out of his shackles and he freed the other slaves, and then they took over the ship. They staged a revolt, and they tried to turn the ship around to take it home to Africa. But unfortunately, there were still some sailors on the ship who were being treacherous, and so there was this tussle of turning the ship one way and then turning it back the other. So they wound up in New England. And when they wound up in New England in the northern states, they were claimed as property of the U.S., but then they went on trial to try to get their freedom, these 53 slaves. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, where the slaves actually won, as the slave trade was illegal in the United States in 1808, and it was 1841 at the time during that leg of the trial. So they were actually returned to Africa. Another revolution in this case, or a revolt, that you guys should hear about is what happened in Haiti. So in Haiti, it was interesting because there were 5 different groups within their population, and 2 of them were groups of white people who were living there, and then 3 of them were groups of black people who were living there. And so Haiti was a colony of France at the time in the 1700s. And they grew things like sugar and indigo and coffee and cotton, and it was really hard and intensive work. But then the French Revolution happened in 1789, and some of these people who were in Haiti thought, that's interesting. So these people fought against their oppressors, and they won, so why can't we do the same thing? So it inspired this huge slave rebellion that went in waves. And so basically, it was a long fight, though. It went from 1791 until 1803. And there were a lot of different surges within it and a lot of different moving parts. Someone keeps reminding me. Okay, so here's the thing. I talked about the population, right? Originally, when it was a French colony, it was called Saint-Domingue, right? It's called Haiti now. And it had free blacks, it had runaway blacks, it had slaves, it had planters and masters, and then it had petits blancs. So little whites, basically, is what that translates into. Some of them owned slaves, but most of them were unhappy with the way that the French were ruling the colony. So basically, France tried to regain control of the colony several times. They couldn't, and the Haitian slaves became free in 1804 and set up their own government. So here's your 4th question. Go ahead and pause the video so that you can get this down. It was, what were some ways that slaves escaped? So we're going to learn about runaways, the Underground Railroad, and then this major conductor on the Underground Railroad named William Still. And then there's also the story of Henry Box Brown that you should hear. It's a really crazy story. So with runaways, so you want to get down some notes about this, guys, right, on your page. So with runaways, slavery was legally established in Virginia in the 1660s when it was still a British colony, right? And soon after, there were laws that were passed about how runaway slaves needed to be returned to their masters. In the Constitutional Convention of 1787, we already talked about that clause with runaway slaves being returned. And then there were 2 fugitive slave laws that were also passed, one in 1793 and then another in 1850, each one getting progressively more strict than the one before it. Because runaway slaves was a big issue. I mean, basically for southern plantation owners or masters, it would be a loss of their money or their capital is what they saw their slaves as property. So a typical runaway would be between their mid to late 20s, and it was majority men. So it was 78 to 82% men in this one source that I was reading from the databases. And it was about 18 to 22% women. Now, some of the reasons for that is because women were more tied to their families and they didn't want to leave children behind and that kind of thing, whereas men felt that they could go. So there were some pregnant women, though, who did make the journey, and there were some women who attempted to escape with their children or had to leave some children behind, as is the case with another person we'll see coming up. So the majority of the escapes were done on foot, although a few might escape on horseback or by boat. There were some that took a boat to go up to a northern state or something like that. And then here's something that's really interesting. Some slaves stayed hidden in these things called maroon societies, which is where slaves would hide out together, either in a swamp or in some kind of desolate area or something like that, to avoid recapture. And some of them would stay there for days, and some of them for weeks, some for months. Some stayed for years in these maroon societies, like indefinitely. The biggest one, or one of the biggest ones that you should be aware of, is one called the Great Dismal Swamp. Sounds great, right? But it's a place where slave catchers wouldn't even go into because, well, they would rarely venture into it because they knew that there were a lot of runaway slaves in there and they could potentially be attacked and that kind of stuff. So they pretty much stayed away from that area. But it was in southwestern Virginia and northeastern North Carolina. So it crosses into both states. Now, the motivations for slaves to run is because they wanted to find lost family members, or they were under threat of being moved farther south and west to other states that were kind of expanding the slave system. And what you can see on your screen here is you've got two ads, right? Two ads that are put in the paper by masters who were trying to recapture their slaves. And so they would offer rewards to try to get them back, and they would put in a description of what the slave looked like, including, marks from abuse and that kind of stuff. So the Underground Railroad is another thing that you guys should be aware of, and it started up in the 1830s, and that map shows kind of a network, the red trails of the Underground Railroad, and it helped a really large number of slaves run away. It's estimated that anywhere from 50,000 to maybe even as many as 100,000 slaves were helped along these routes between the 1820s and 1865, when the Civil War ended and thus slavery ended. So there's a couple of terms you should be aware of. Agents are those people who assisted slaves in any kind of form. Conductors are people like Harriet Tubman, who actually led slaves along the route, so led them from one place to the next, guiding them to safety. Stations were the hiding places, so it might be someone's cellar, or it might be under the floorboards in their living room, or out in the stables with the animals or something like that. But there were all kinds of places along the way. And then the cargo would be the actual slaves themselves who were in transit. So the routes mainly went up to Canada, though there were some shorter ones that went, say, from Florida to Cuba or from Texas to Mexico. And Harriet Tubman, she actually led 300 slaves or something more out of slavery herself, which is pretty impressive. So here's another conductor along the Underground Railroad. His name was William Still, and he was a man who was born free in the North. He was the 18th child of two former slaves. First, his father actually purchased his own freedom, and then his mother escaped later on with two children, but she had to leave other kids behind. And so he settled in Philadelphia as an adult, and he became a major conductor on the Underground Railroad for over 20 years. He also became kind of an important person in this major abolitionist society in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania. And what was interesting about William Still is he wrote down all these different records of these slaves that he helped. Like, he kept these records, which could have been really dangerous because that could have been used to implicate him as a conductor. But another thing that happened is Still, one of his long-lost brothers who had been kept in slavery after his mother had escaped, his brother Peter is one of the people who he actually assisted on the Underground Railroad. So he did destroy all of his written records during the time of the Civil War, I believe, because he was afraid that they were going to be discovered. But later on, he wrote a book about the Underground Railroad. And then there's this other guy that you should be aware of, and his name is Henry Box Brown. And the reason why he's called Box is because he actually got mailed, or he got sent from Richmond, Virginia, all the way up to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And it's William Still who actually received him as a package. So he spent 27 hours in this journey by